Metabolic health is actually, we're noticing drastic improvements in a certain subset of the population, but the vast majority of the general population, their metabolic health continues to deteriorate, which is very sad, but also very true. And the Lancet article is, I think, absolutely accurate.
And so with protein and with fat, you can hit the satiety point where you're full. You're like, I don't want more food because I'm too full. But that never happens with carbohydrates. And that in and of itself is a huge problem.
First of all, it's not fair. I totally agree. It's not fair. It's also not your fault, but it 100% is your problem. Yeah, it is a teeny tiny step forward because they did address the issue of added sugar for very young children, which I think is vital to address. But they then proceeded to ignore all the other nutrition issues that are vital for optimal human growth, development, function. And when I say function, I always mean physical and mental function. It's very important. The mental often gets left out. It's obvious from the way the working group was set up, and they actually have now admitted that they were not in charge of their agenda. The USDA they set the agenda. And so even if this working group, this committee had wanted to say, hey, let's really look at the low carb literature, of which there are now hundreds of articles, peer-reviewed articles published, showing the benefits and the advantage to eating a low carb diet, they couldn't have taken up that subject because their agenda was set in Washington. And obviously, if they tried to deviate from that, they would have been relieved of duty. And so I think some of the blame does lie with the working group, but ultimately the blame lies further up the chain of command, as often it does, right? There is a huge worldwide movement against eating meat. Mm-hmm. And so you can't really blame the big meat, if you want to call it that, for spending millions of dollars in lobbying and ads, because they're under active literal attack. So you can't really blame them. But when you start wondering why Kellogg's and Kraft and Post and General Mills and Coke and Pepsi, why are they spending all these millions lobbying the federal government if they know that their product is safe and healthy and people obviously love it, right? So why would they spend that money unless they'd either discovered in their research or have always known that their product is not safe and is not healthy for human consumption? Ultimately, the actions of any big corporation, it legally has to be to the shareholders and to the profits and to the stock price. That's what the board of directors work. That's who they work for. That's their boss. And so if, just like back in the 90s, when it was obvious, big tobacco, they knew nicotine was habit forming. They knew that smoking cigarettes caused cancer or increased your risk of developing cancer. They knew this and they had the research, but they didn't talk about that. Just like they knew that, I suspect that the big food, the billion-dollar multinational corporations that sell us this highly ultra-processed food, I think they know this. I think they already know it's not healthy. It promotes insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, obesity, fatty liver, type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes. I think their scientists are well aware of this, and I think they probably have the reports. It'd be interesting what a Freedom of Information Act or a subpoena might uncover in their documentation. Wouldn't that be interesting? And so if you're a corporation like that, then sure, you're going to spend millions of dollars every year lobbying the federal government, saying, hey, let's not talk about that. Let's focus on other things.
Absolutely. Well, and I think about a book in particular that I feel like really shifted my perspective as a clinician and human being was Sugar, Fat, Salt. And for anyone that hasn't read that book, it's an expose on the processed food industry. Yep. And so there are food scientists that their job is to make the foods as addictive as possible. There's this bliss point, they bring in study groups to determine, at what point do people find the substance, whether it's soda or gosh, some type of new chip, at what point is it truly irresistible? And so you really are at a loss for an ability to not have a desire to continue eating this processed garbage. So
Yeah.
I thought that was really very telling.
Yeah.
And,
I think
given
that's an excellent book. I've listened to it twice on Audible. It's very good. The author is a little bit behind on the research, but very good book overall. The author really tries to tie the combination of fat and sugar together and that is in fact the bliss point. The reason humans crave fat is because there are essential fatty acids we absolutely need, or we'll get sick, we'll suffer, we'll die ultimately. But there is no essential carbohydrate, no essential starch, no essential sugar. And so when we look, and most all the addiction research has been done in rodents, right? Mice and rats. And they can absolutely get rodents addicted to sugar, but also they can get rodents addicted to sweet tastes. And so it can even be non-nutritive sweeteners. It can be saccharin. And the research hasn't been done on the keto or low carb approved sweeteners, but I suspect that they're just as habit forming because it's actually a evolutionarily passed on crave for sweetness, right? Because we need that sweetness in the fall when the fruit's ripe and the berries ripe. We need to put on 5 or 10 pounds of fat so we don't starve to death over the winter. And the big food corporations are taking advantage of that, right? They know that we have an instinctual drive to eat fat because we need fatty acids. And then we have this instinctual drive to seek out sweet tastes so that we can put on weight for the coming winter and don't starve to death. And that way we can continue to propagate the species. And so the rodent research is very interesting because never has there been a rodent study done that says, man, look, when you give these rats access to cocaine or to saturated fat from beef tallow or bacon grease or coconut oil or avocado, there's not a single study that shows that you can get rats addicted to fat. Now they love it, they'll eat it, but you cannot get them to the point where they'll push the bacon grease lever more than they push the cocaine lever. That I've never seen a study in rodents, but you can absolutely addict a rat to sugar or saccharin, or in my opinion, any sweetener, and they'll wind up pushing the sweet lever more than they push the cocaine lever. Right. And so when this author talks about the fat and sugar together, I think that it muddies the water because ultimately what you can become addicted to is the sweet taste of any sweetener and highly processed carbohydrates, which the more you process them, the more they just become pure sugar. Right. And so the Bliss Point I wish every American knew about the Bliss Point and the millions of dollars that the big food manufacturers have spent with food scientists, nutrition scientists, biologists, figuring out what's the perfect blend of salt, sugar, and fat so that essentially they hack into your biological software and they hack it. They put a virus into your code. And it just knocks people off the rails and they wind up living on sweets and potato chips and soda because that causes a spike in dopamine and maybe even oxytocin because of this wiring that the big food manufacturers have basically hijacked.
And I think it's really profoundly powerful for people to understand that this biochemical process that happens in our brains, in our bodies, is a direct result of the consumption of these highly palatable, highly processed foods. And much to your point, I think that, whether it's keto or the paleo community, people will say, well, I'm going to have monk fruit or I'm going to have thyrotol or I'm going to have stevia because it's considered to be clean. And I get that, there's a desire to find a cleaner option, but, a rose by any other rose is still a rose. And so I like to remind people that whether it's a keto fat bomb or, 15 scoops of sugar sweetened almond butter, too much of any one thing is not beneficial. And I think that the key thing when people are looking at macros is satiety. And so with protein and with fat, you can hit the satiety point where you're full. You're like, I don't want more food because I'm too full. But that never happens with carbohydrates. And that in and of itself is a huge problem. Now, one thing that I've come to realize, after years of working with patients and now, with clients, that weight loss, that's oftentimes the focus at the beginning of a new year. It's like, I'm going to clean up all my bad habits and I'm going to finally get this 5, 10, 15, 20 plus pounds off. And so I would imagine that you have gotten quite savvy in this area because of your own, patients' struggles and their own concerns. And so let's pivot a little bit and let's talk about some of the reasons why people can get stuck. And so obviously dietary input is a huge component of it. I would say it all starts with food, but what are some of the other pieces of the puzzle that could be contributing to why men or women are really struggling with losing weight?
Well, I mean, we're living through a very trying time, and to pretend that this is the worst time in human history, I think is probably foolish. We've been through some catastrophes in our history on this planet, but anytime you're under stress, you're always looking for some relief, some release, right? And you're looking for that dopamine hit and that oxytocin hit to make you feel better, to make you feel less bad, right? Depending. And so many of the avenues of positive reinforcement have currently been cut off to the majority of humanity. You can't go to a family reunion with, 200 or 300 of your family members. You can't go to a conference with all your colleagues and your peers. You can't do any of those things. And so I think a lot of people, you're basically stuck in the house, and attached to every house is a kitchen. And in every kitchen is a pantry and a fridge. And so eating is absolutely not a bad behavior. And that's one of the many things that people get so confused on. Every time they eat, they beat themselves up. They're like, I'm a glutton, I'm a bad person, I'm weak. Eating is physiologically, that is a normal behavior. That's a good behavior that you should never be ashamed of eating or feel guilty that you ate. It all comes down to what it is that you just consumed. That's where it lies. And so knowing from these rodent models that sugar and other sweeteners are just as addictive literally just as addictive as cocaine to rodents. And I hope I said this earlier, but let me say, we have never found a substance that's addictive in rodents that is also not addictive in humans. And so a lot of times the rodent models, they get poo-pooed, right? Because they're like, well, that's a rat. I'm not a rat, I'm a human. And that's a valid argument in some cases. But in this case, we have never found a single substance that rats become addicted and exhibit addictive behavior to that isn't also addictive in human beings, right? And that's alcohol, nicotine, the illicit drugs, and then sugar or sweet taste. And so when people are basically imprisoned from all these other positive outlets that raise your dopamine, raise your oxytocin, being with family, being with friends, hugs and kisses, going to the gym without feeling like you're under house arrest, that sort of thing. A lot of people find the wrong outlets because you can get that dopamine hit. You can get it from cocaine. You can get it from alcohol, you can get it from the other drugs, but you can also get it from sugar and sweet tasting things. And I'll make a confession right here on your show. Over the holidays, my wife Nisha and our good friend Melissa, they're both excellent cooks and bakers. And they made lots of keto treats, lots of keto cakes and pies and cookies and fat bombs and nut clusters. And I indulged more than I should. And I'll be the first to stand in front of the mirror or stand before the public and say, I am a sugar addict. There is no doubt about that. And even with the keto approved sweeteners, the paleo low carb approved sweeteners, even now, well into January, it's still calling to me. I'm like, I wonder if there's any of those fat bombs left. Are there any of those nut clusters? And so a couple of days ago, Nisha and I had to go through the kitchen, the refrigerator, the pantry, and we threw it all in the garbage. because if it's in the house and under these conditions, I'm going to eat it. And I'm going to try not to eat it, but I'm going to fail and I'm going to eat it. And for me, my weakest time is usually in the evening. And so typically when I'm eating clean for weeks and weeks or months and months at a time, I'm never even hungry in the evening, just not at all. But after just a few days of the low carb keto sweets and treats, oh yeah, last evening I was like, do we have any of that? And she's like, look, you understand this is the monkey on your back talking. I'm like,
Yeah.
damn it. Yeah, you're right. No, you're right. I'm not really hungry. I'm just craving those sweets. And so I'm going to have to go through a few days of having zero sweetener in my diet. And then it'll be effortless again. Once I break that little addictive cycle that I was starting to reinforce again over the holidays, I'll be fine. And I'll never even give a second thought to eating anything or drinking anything with a sweet taste to it. And that's a really powerful place to be for people who, I mean, currently we feel like we don't really have control over anything in our environment. How many people feel that way? I'm not in control of where I can go, who I can see, who I can talk to, even what I can tweet on social media. I'm antsy. I'm nervous. This is a weird time. So, but you do have 100% absolute control over the food that's in your house and the food that you put in your mouth. And reclaiming that control can actually open up avenues where you can have control over other parts of your life as well. But I think for so many people, the first step is to reclaim your proper human diet, stick to that, enforce that in yourself, and then exemplify that for your loved ones and your friends. That's a powerful step. And that's a step that can open many doors so that people can have power over other parts of their life as well. But it really starts with the basic biological and physiological functions. If you're not in charge of those, so for instance, if you're addicted to alcohol right now during this time, guess what you're doing a lot of? You're drinking every day to try to feel normal because the alcohol has abducted your physiological processes, right? It makes you feel normal, but you know in your intellectual mind that ain't normal. That's not normal to have to drink every day to feel normal, or to have to smoke weed every day, or have to snort some powder every day to feel good or to feel normal. You're not in charge. You have no power over that situation. Currently, you're a slave to whatever your addiction is, and that can include sugar, and it can include the other sweeteners for some of us. Just like every biological function, Cynthia, there's a bell curve, right? Some people can smoke crack 2 or 3 times and then walk away from it and never touch it again. Other people, if they smoke crack one time, that's it. They're addicted, they're hooked, and it's going to take months and months and months to break that addiction. Same goes for alcohol, same goes for nicotine. There's a bell curve for that. And so you see these lean, healthy 20-something-year-olds on Twitter yelling at everybody to quit being gluttons and sloths and just walk away, say no to the food, eat less and move more. But they're on the other end of the bell curve where they're not susceptible to this addiction, to carbs and to sugar and to sweeteners. And so that's easy for them to say, but I'm on the other end of the spectrum. 3 or 4 days of keto sweeteners, and my monkey is calling to me again.
Well, and
And
it's,
so
sorry.
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it's important for our listeners to really understand that we are humans. Like, yes, we, are experts in the health and wellness space, but I like to talk about the fact I have teenage boys who do have sweet tooths on occasion and will make a dozen cookies for themselves and eat most of them. I mean, they're both athletic and they're both very healthy, but they on occasion will do that. And so probably between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I probably had 2 or 3 days where I had several gluten-free cookies. And I only in the past couple months started weighing myself regularly to stay accountable. I thought, if I'm telling my clients to do this, I should really be doing this myself. And do you know, I gained 4 pounds. I'm sure it was just from the glycogen stores, 4
Yep.
pounds eating
Yep.
cookies. And I'm obviously in my latter 40s. So it just goes to show, much to your point, then what was I thinking about every day? Those cookies. I wanted to have more cookies. I needed to make more cookies. I needed to have more cookies. And I finally said to my husband, we can't make cookies anymore. Or if we make cookies, I really have to just pretend I don't see said cookies. That was there's no moderation for me in a cookie. I don't care how clean it is. I like to eat cookies and I can't moderate my intake. Now, however, much to your point, obviously I'm not going to make chocolate as a comparison to crack, but I could eat a piece of chocolate and be very happy with a piece of chocolate and walk away from it and not eat it excessively. So for anyone who's listening who thinks, oh, this probably doesn't really happen. It does. It even happens to us, but we're so cognizant. And it took me like a week to lose the 4 pounds. And all I did was just clean up my diet. And I was like amazed at how long it took to lose that 4 pounds. But 4 pounds of sugar and inflammation and God knows what else, my body was just like, ugh. And then you're craving more sugar. And so that vicious cycle perpetuates and continues. And I think it's really important to say that depending on where we are in our life, so obviously my teenagers, 20 somethings, some 30 somethings have a lot more leeway in their dietary indiscretions than you do in middle age and beyond. And that's okay. It's not a criticism. It's just an observation. And so I think it's vitally important for us to be honest with ourselves. I think that's really where it starts from. Like, do I have a problem with this substance, irrespective of what it is?
Yeah, I totally agree. And it sounds like you're on the end of the spectrum where I am, where too much sweeteners and too much highly processed carbohydrates, and you're addicted. And I think that not everyone, but a large percentage of adults are in that boat. And the first thing that has to happen is you have to own up to that and be like, yeah, first of all, it's not fair. I totally agree. It's not fair. It's also not your fault, but it 100% is your problem. And the only way you're ever going to be able to address the problem is to own it and say, and look in the mirror and say, I'm a sugar addict. I'm a sweetaholic. And also own up to that to your family and friends and say, look, you got to stop with the cookies. Okay. Just like to your boys, you're like, I love you. And I know you love cookies and you're able to tolerate it, but you got to keep the damn cookies out of my face. If you're going to make them, you cook them when I'm not home and you keep them in your bedroom or something. I don't know, but I mean, and people get this intuitively. If someone is a recovering alcoholic, they would never offer them a drink. And so I think as the concept of sugar addiction and sweetaholic, I think as that gains traction in society, people will become more respectful of this. But currently, people think, well, if my grandmother made it, it's got to be safe because my grandmother was very wise and she loved me. She would never make something for me that's unhealthy or dangerous or addictive or would make me sick. But the problem is your grandmother and your mother were fed the same advertising as you're being fed now. And that's when it really started, is with our grandmothers. That's who started seeing all the ads for Crisco, all the ads for Martha White, all the ads for Kellogg's and Post. And so they blindly trusted all these advertisements, just as many of us trust these advertisements. But the time has come. I mean, there literally is only 12% of the United States population who doesn't have at least one marker of metabolic syndrome. 88% of adults in the United States have at least one marker, if not more, of metabolic syndrome. How is that not a huge rallying cry for people all over this country to go, what the literal hell is going on here? How is it that the majority of us are sick and the federal government doesn't really seem that interested in the obvious root causes of what's causing this? And so again, back to my earlier point, that's why Kellogg's and Kraft and Coke and Pepsi spend millions of dollars a year lobbying the federal government so that they can be too busy to really look and say, why is 88% of the US population of adults, why do they have one marker of metabolic syndrome? That's weird. And that's also, I mean, is that not a national security risk? Is that not a national health crisis? Sure sounds like it to me, but it seems that you and I and people in this space are the only ones ringing the alarm bell. And the only reason that could possibly be is that the lobbyists and the marketing firms are quite successful and quite good at what they do.
I think this is such an invaluable conversation because I think in many ways, when people get a metabolic health diagnosis, they're told they have diabetes, they have PCOS, they're hypertensive, they've got cardiovascular disease, etc. They assume that this is just a process of aging. I hear that from so many people. They think it's normal to slowly become insulin resistant. They think it's normal to have aches and pains. They think it's normal to be on 20 different medications. And in cardiology, we had patients on 30 to 40 medications because you'd put them on one and then they need 2 more to correct the side effects they got. You know, you put them on a diuretic and then they have low potassium. So then they go on potassium, then they get gout. I mean, it's kind of like it becomes this very overwhelming system that we're working within. But everyone that's listening can do these labs, and everyone can have an honest conversation with themselves. So we talk about lab work. We talked about some of the statistics. What are your thoughts on glucometers and CGMs? And the reason why I'm asking is that I take heat almost every single day on social media. How dare I suggest that someone who does not have diabetes monitor their blood sugar? I mean, lately it's been a lot of physicians who've come after me, but in particular, there's a vegan cardiologist who likes to come after me specifically for this purpose. Where do you feel like CGMs and glucometers can be beneficial for our patients to better understand the net impact of nutrition and stress and lifestyle?
I think they're invaluable. I think you can't even put a price on their value for somebody who does not have type 2 diabetes. And I've also gotten some kickback from, and typically plant-based or vegan friendly cardiologists. They've actually accused me of doing harm to people. Like you're going to cause eating disorders in people by recommending glucometers or continuous glucose monitors to people. And there's actually a new research study out, I'm sure you've seen it, that shows that people without any diagnosis of type 2 diabetes at all, they benefit metabolically from wearing a continuous glucose monitor for a few weeks. You immediately start to see what causes blood sugar spikes. When you eat it, it causes this. When you eat this as an alternative, it only causes this. That's brilliant. I mean, I would love it. I would love to put a continuous glucose monitor on every single living human being on the planet for 2 weeks and say, learn from this. If something spikes your blood sugar, that's junk. You don't need to be eating that on a daily basis. Maybe for your anniversary or your birthday, it's fine to have a little bit of that. But on a daily basis, you don't need to be eating anything that spikes your blood sugar. And we're talking about people who have no diagnosis at all. We're talking about young metabolically healthy people in their teens and 20s and 30s. You put a CGM on them, and that's another great way to say immediately, oh man, you ate this, you drank that fruit juice smoothie that influencer recommended, your blood sugar went up to 190. That's a huge red flag. That's bad nutrition advice. You ate that beautiful yogurt bowl, right? And your blood sugar went to 210. That is a huge red flag that is not a part of a proper human diet. And so I think I find it almost conspiratorial, Cynthia, that some of these plant-based and vegan cardiologists are so opposed to this. And I don't think that they're consciously trying to keep people in the dark, but it makes me worry about their unconscious motivation. Like, why are you so worried that people will see that the foods that you're recommending spikes their blood sugar to above 140? Why are you worried about that so much that you're coming after me personally? And I always hesitate to assign malintent to people. And I don't think it's conscious. I think they mean well. And I think they truly believe that a plant-based diet is the proper human diet. But it's worrisome, isn't it? It's weird that they're so aggressively against continuous glucose monitors. And I think as more research comes out on CGMs, I think that they'll have to back away from that stance, and they'll have to shut up about that, because it's going to become clearly self-evident that when somebody wears a continuous glucose monitor for 2 or 3 weeks, they learn about their diet. They learn, oh, I shouldn't eat that very often at all, because man, look what that did to my blood sugar. And even young metabolically healthy people, after a couple of weeks of wearing this, there was a study done with Harvard medical students, who were uniformly in their 20s. And every single one of them reported, I had no idea that fill in the blank would do this to my blood sugar. I'm going to eat less of that in the future. Right. And I think if you put this on 20-something-year-old anybody's, whether they're a Harvard medical student or whether they're currently unemployed or on unemployment benefits, they're going to be like, oh my God, I had no idea. Because, people by definition, a human being by definition wants to be healthy. They want to make smart decisions, but if they've been deluded and misinformed their entire life, how can they possibly be trusted to make smart decisions? And the vast majority of people in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s have been misinformed by authority figures who they should be able to trust. They've been misinformed. And when you put something like a CGM on them for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, immediately they're like, whoa, I had no idea. I will change my behavior immediately. And I think doctors don't believe that patients want to be healthy. I think that they uniformly, almost without exception, believe that patients are lazy and dumb and don't care. That's what the average doctor believes. And I don't believe that's true at all. I think the average patient wants very much to be healthy. They want very much to improve their health, but they don't know how because they've been given so much false information, so much misinformation that in many cases they have given up. It's like, I don't think any of this crap, it works. I'm just going to eat whatever I want and I'll just take all these pills and injections because I don't even know what the truth is anymore. And I don't think anybody knows. But when you prove yourself like you do every single day, and like I do, and like other people who are in our sphere of influence, when somebody says, okay, I've tried 400 diets, I've listened to every health influencer out there, I've listened to the ADA, the AHA, but I'm just going to suspend my disbelief and I'm going to just do what Cynthia tells me for a month or two. I mean, what could it hurt, right? Okay. At the end of that month or two, guess what? Their metabolic disease is measurably improved. It's measurably better, not just subjectively, because subjectively they're going to feel better. Yeah. But they can check black and white lab values and go, wow, just in a month, my A1C went down that much. Just in a month, my fasting insulin went down that much. Maybe there is an answer. And so not only are you giving great nutrition advice that's going to protect their health and improve their health and protect them from that 3.5 years of lost life per decade, they're going to feel better too. And they can immediately test. Well, let's see if Cynthia Thurlow knows what the hell she's talking about. Let me check an A1C and a fasting insulin and my triglycerides. Let me check a CRP. Let me check these labs. Boom. They are demonstrably better in a month or 2 or 3. That's the verification people are looking for. And when the average patients, and I'm talking to doctors right now as well as I am patients, you think your patients are dumb and lazy and don't care, but you give them a system like the proper human diet, and in a month, they can see black and white differences in their labs. And when they look in the mirror, they can see a difference in just their appearance generally. And they know how they feel each and every day. They can notice, I feel so much better. I'm less mentally foggy. I just feel better. People are hungry for that. People are on fire for that. And once they understand the foundational principles of what Cynthia's talking about, what I'm talking about, or any other number of people, they're like, that's it. That's how I'm going to eat for the rest of my life. And they're immediately, not only are they highly motivated to learn as much as they can and to implement as much as they can into their daily lifestyle and their daily diet, now they're almost a missionary, right? They're out telling their friends and family spontaneously, sometimes annoyingly, right? Because if the people aren't ready to hear it yet, but they're out like, dude, you got to stop eating that. You got to stop drinking that. That's going to make you metabolically sick. And I've been practicing medicine for over 22 years now. And I have never had a patient who becomes a missionary for a prescription medication or for a medical procedure like they do when they understand the principles of a proper human diet, they implement it, they see not only I feel better, yeah, I feel better, I look better, my clothes fit better, but also all of my objective markers. When I have my labs checked, they're all better. My blood pressure is better. My blood sugar on this continuous glucose monitor is better. My A1C is better. Fasting insulin, fasting albumin, all that's verifiably better. I can't even argue with it. They're sold. They're like, that's it. And so I've never seen patients become missionaries for like, oh, I took, glyburide, and now I'm out on the streets telling people you need to take glyburide. Nobody's doing that, because glyburide lowers your A1C 2 or 3/10 of a percentage point, has a whole host of side effects, and it costs money. Nobody's going to promote that, because the only people who are going to promote pharmaceuticals are the pharmaceutical companies. And let's just talk about this for a second. The FTC just sent out a letter to several influencers on social media and said, hey, you're taking money from the American beverage lobbying company, right? You're getting thousands of dollars, and you're not saying on your post, this is a sponsored post, and these influencers are saying things like, you can drink Coca-Cola in moderation, it's fine. Well, guess what? They got a check to say that. And then they didn't disclose that to the followers who love and trust them. And you can look these people up if you'd like to. And almost all of them are registered dietitians. That's why they got a letter from the FTC, because they are in a fiduciary responsibility position. You've got initials behind your name. You can't just be taking $1,000 from Coca-Cola and then saying it's fine to drink Coca-Cola in moderation. That's the FTC will fine you for that. And they, I think 12 of them got letters saying, hey, you need to cease and desist immediately, or you can write us a check. Either way. So many people don't realize that kind of stuff. And these influencers are more and more very concerning. They're starting to say, well, obesity is genetic, or type 2 diabetes is genetic. And the plant-based cardiologist I was talking about earlier, he tried to say that type 2 diabetes was genetic. And the guy he was having a discussion with was like, what are you talking about? Dude, hundreds of thousands of people have reversed their type 2 diabetes back to normal by eating a proper human diet. How can you even pretend that that's genetic? Now, you may have a 1 or 2% predisposition to obesity, or 1 or 2% predisposition to type 2 diabetes. Yeah, absolutely. You might have that little tiny genetic predisposition to develop those. But that's never going to make you obese. It's never going to make you type 2 diabetic. Only your diet can do that. And inappropriate dietary decisions made on a daily basis for many, many years are going to give you those things. So that's what I want people to watch for is now the influencers are saying it's genetic that you're obese. It's genetic that you have severe obesity. It's not your fault, but there is a FDA approved medication that can fight against your genetics. Right? It's genetic that you have type 2 diabetes, but there is this new drug that you can use. To me, that is dastardly. I mean, that they should be embarrassed that they're saying such things coming from a position of authority that their follower base gives them. It's very concerning, and I don't think it's going to end well for some of them. But people have to be on the alert for this kind of misinformation that very often is being put out there by mainstream associations and mainstream news media. Nobody cares about your health. Everybody just they want your clicks and they want your dollars. That's literally all they want from you. They want your eyeballs on their news story or their ad. They want you to click on it, and they want you to send them $7 or more. Literally, that's all they care about. And all the donations they get if they're a nonprofit, like the American Diabetes Association, who gets millions of dollars each and every year from big food companies and big pharmaceutical companies. They don't give a damn what your A1C is in reality. They just want your money. And so people have to protect themselves, because you only have one life. And if you waste that life listening to the wrong authorities, you and your family, that's who's going to suffer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I recall from our last conversation, you were using, and so many good points that you just made, 140 milligrams per deciliter. So when people are, whether they have a fasting glucose, they're looking at CGM data, glucometer data, 140 is about the max you ever want to see on a device. Because when you go over 140, you're damaging the intimal lining of your arteries. You are damaging the very delicate blood vessels to your eye. You're damaging arteries and capillaries and distribution beds in your kidneys. You're damaging your heart. And so I wanted to make sure that I talked about that, because more often than not, I get asked the question, what's your threshold? Like if you were to go have cake on your birthday and have nothing else in your stomach, and I always say, if my blood sugar goes above 120, that's unusual for me. And I really want to know what's driving it. So 140, I know based on our last conversation, and I 100% agree with you about our patients. They are not dumb and lazy. These are individuals who want to do better. They want to be healthy. They don't want to be on a bunch of medications. They don't want to feel poorly. They don't want to be beholden to a system that really is focused on pharmaceuticals for a lot of lifestyle issues. And so one of the things that I found really interesting that's relevant to this is there was a recent AHA, so American Heart Association has a new diagnosis. They're now calling the cardiovascular kidney metabolic syndrome, or CKM. This is a presidential advisory group for circulation. This is a consensus statement. They identified that the cost of this metabolic syndrome that is now evolved is 1.7 trillion annually. It is characterized by the metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and also these high triglycerides. And what I found interesting was they talked about lifestyle modifications, which I was like, that's great. But what I didn't love is the early use of medications, specifically these GLP-1 agonists. So let's talk about that for a second, because I know there's a lot of interest. I know we have influencers. We have very thin people in Hollywood that are using GLP-1s to stay really thin, but they're marketing this for our metabolic syndrome patients. And they're de-emphasizing, which I believe they're going to focus more on the meds as opposed to the lifestyle changes. Sure. What are your thoughts on the GLP-1 agonists for this particular population?
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about that syndrome that they've just discovered. Right. What's another thing that you could call that? Metabolic syndrome.
Yep.
Right. What's another thing you could call it? Hyperinsulinemia. So when you call it what they called it, it makes it sound like this crazy, sciencey, complicated thing. The average person is gonna be like, I can't even pronounce that, much less, well, I don't know what to do about that. It's kind of the same way with metabolic syndrome. You're like, well, syndrome kind of sounds like maybe it's genetic. I don't know. But it's all these different seemingly unconnected things. But when you boil it down to, it's all hyperinsulinemia. Now they're like, oh, hyperinsulinemia. Okay, so that's high insulin. Okay, let me look that up. You can Google that, even if you're, a truck driver with an 8th grade education. You can Google that and go, oh, elevated insulin. Okay, so I wonder if there's a test for that. Lo and behold, yeah, and onyourlabs.com, you can get that checked for $10. Okay, so what causes hyperinsulinemia? Well, in one person out of a million, it's an insulinoma. But in 99.999% of people, it's eating too many carbohydrates in your diet. Okay, so just the average. Well, let's stay with our truck driver. He left school at 8th grade. He's like, okay, so what foods cause my insulin to go up? Okay, he looks that up. Now he's got a list. Okay, I'm going to stop eating those foods. Well, guess what? That huge syndrome that the American Heart Association is wanting to talk about, our 8th grade truck driver can cure that if you call it by its true name and simplify it as much as possible. It's hyperinsulinemia. That's what it is. And so that's why I try to simplify these things. And as they evidently are trying to complicate it. Oh, metabolic syndrome was too easy to understand. Let's call it this new syndrome. And then, of course, it's genetic. I mean, how could you even have a condition with that many letters in it, that many syllables? Must be genetic. So I just need to take these GLP-1 inhibitors, right? And so this is the new pharmaceutical darling. This is one of the things many of the registered dietitians on social media are promoting now. Many of them paid by the pharmaceutical company, many of them not disclosing that. Attention FTC, if you're watching this, they maybe need to get a letter in the mail as well. Many doctors are talking about GLP-1 inhibitors, and they are absolutely being sponsored either directly or indirectly by the pharmaceutical corporation. They're not disclosing that. Maybe the FTC needs to look into that as well. What you're basically doing is you're taking the patient's ability to improve their own health, you're taking it completely away from them when you give it a name like this. Right. And then you're like, and then you also hint around that obesity and type 2 diabetes and this new syndrome, they're all genetic. Nothing you can do about it. So just take this weekly injection. And yeah, it's expensive as hell. And yeah, there's a black box warning on it. And yeah, there are literally no long-term studies in humans showing if there's any long-term consequences of taking this. We literally don't know. We are actually doing a long-term experiment in humans to see if there's any terrible side effects. You are the experiment, the patient. When you go to the pharmacy and get that, we're depending on you and your doctor. If anything really terribly bad happens to you, we want you to report that to your doctor. Your doctor's going to report that to the database. And then in 10 years, we'll do a study of all you guinea pigs. I mean, patients. And we'll see if there's any long-term ramifications of injecting this medicine weekly. That's literally what's happening right now, Cynthia. And the average patient has no clue that they're part of the long-term study. There's never been a long-term study proving these medications to be safe for long-term use in human beings. Every doctor listening to this, part of informed consent would be telling your patients, there's no long-term study showing this is actually even safe for human use, right? I wanted you to know that up front. Now, do you still want the prescription or not? Why are doctors not informing their patients of that? I don't really know, because I would, and I know you would, if I were like, well, there's no long-term study on this. So therefore, if you still want to continue knowing that, then that's informed consent. But doctors aren't doing that. Especially the doctors on TikTok and Instagram. They're not saying there's never been a long-term study. So they're deluding people to try an experimental substance made in a chemical factory that you inject into your body without knowing if it's safe long-term. There's probably adjectives you could use. And I would encourage people to choose your own adjective for that. What would you call that?
Yeah.
Some people would call it evil.
Yeah.
Some people would call it short-sighted. I don't know. You pick your own.
It's interesting. At Thanksgiving, a family member mentioned that they bought stock in Semiglutide, and they wanted to know my opinion. And I said, well, I know that I have colleagues that are using it short term with their patients and giving them a very short term use. But my greatest concern is especially because most of my listenership are women and men north of 40. What's happening is we're getting older, we're losing muscle mass. We know based on the research that's been done, most of the weight that people are losing is related to loss of muscle mass.
Yep.
And if muscle is this organ of longevity, then what are we setting ourselves up for? Like maybe you've lost 20 pounds, but it's going to take you a long time to gain the muscle back that you've lost. And it's so important for insulin sensitivity.
Yeah. And I think your relative, that's probably a brilliant financial investment. But I would not recommend it to a family member to actually use. I would recommend a proper human diet. But yeah, I think it's right now over the next 10 years, it's probably a brilliant investment. But that doesn't make it ethical or moral. I think back in Nazi Germany, there were some corporations that it would have been very wise to invest in back then. They were making things like explosives and poison gas. That doesn't make that investment ethical or moral, but you probably make money on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. In my prep for the podcast, I was looking to see. I was reading about endogenous. So the GLP-1 that our body makes internally, the half-life is about 2 minutes.
Yep.
Contrast that with the half-life of these drugs, which is much longer. I mean, sometimes they're dosed twice a week, sometimes once a week. Just think about how powerful it is to suppress all these downstream effects in the body.
Yep. And here's another problem with the GLP-1s. You have GLP-1 receptors in your brain, and you have them in your gut, right? You also have them in your kidney. You also have them in your liver. So, of course, the pharmaceutical companies are wanting the effects that come from the receptors in the gut and the brain. But do we know what happens when you engage those receptors in the human kidney or the human liver? Where else are GLP-1 receptors? They're pretty much everywhere in the human body. Now, is that a problem? Was that looked into? Do we know what happens when you activate those receptors with long-acting GLP-1 receptor agonists? Do we know? No, we don't know. We have no idea. And so if their GLP-1 agonists were specific to the receptors in the gut and the brain, that'd be less bad. I wouldn't be as worried, but I'm telling you now, I am very worried about the long-term ramifications of these medications. I think that this is going to end very, very badly. I don't think we have any clue what happens to the human kidney when you activate those receptors long-term, every day, constantly. I don't think we have any clue, but I think we're going to find out. And we're going to find out in this long-term experiment that's being performed on patients who have not given their consent to be in this experiment. Any young district attorneys out there listening? Sounds unethical to me, maybe illegal.
That's such a good point. Now, there were a couple questions that came in specific to lipids and looking at diagnostic tests like a CAC, a coronary artery calcification score, looking at the specialized carotid CIMT. What are your thoughts in terms of, when in your workup with your patients, are you leaning into these diagnostics that are giving really good information about what could potentially be going on? Are you looking at ApoBs? Is that something that you focus in on with your patients? Because I know the LDL is starting to kind of seemingly fall out of favor. We're starting to focus more on the ApoB portion. What is your kind of knee-jerk reaction when you have someone that's at higher risk, someone that's working diligently on insulin sensitivity? They may be pre-diabetic. Where are you using those diagnostic tests?
I have a very low threshold for ordering CAC scores and CIMTs and CT angiograms of the heart, depending. I think that effectively anybody with a single risk factor should probably have those tests performed because they're so safe, they're so non-invasive and then the CT angiogram of the heart, you're going to use that for people who are at higher risk. But I have a very low threshold for ordering those. I think they're super underutilized. Now, the CAC score is not perfect, not a perfect test. But if you blend it with the CIMT, then it becomes a pretty darn awesome test, both of which are completely non-invasive. There's really no risk of having those two tests performed in concert. And you glean so much information about the patient's current status. Right. And then that can, and I think typically the main use of those is either to follow the patient or perhaps sometimes more importantly, as a wake-up call where you can show them on your computer monitor, look, dude, this damage right here has already been done. Some of it may even be permanent. This is important. This is serious. You need to change right now and stay changed for the rest of your life. In many people, that's that little extra bit of motivation they need to go, okay, that's it. PhD forever. I'm never straying again. And so now ApoB and LP(a) and all these other sexy markers. The problem I have with these markers is, first of all, I consider them to still be somewhat experimental. I don't think that we've been checking them long enough. I don't think we have a large enough patient database. I don't think we have enough meaningful research showing that they are a useful proxy marker for heart attack and stroke. That's my first problem with them. My second problem with them is the vast majority of physicians, if they check an ApoB and an LP(a), what's going to be their solution if they're abnormal? It's the prescription pad, right? There's not going to be any discussion because, I mean, ApoB and LP(a), that sounds very genetic, doesn't it? Right? And I think there's some new, and LDL cholesterol is a dead model, and it's about to be really dead when the new research study that my friend has done, he's lowered his LDL cholesterol more by eating Oreo cookies than Crestor or Lipitor or Zocor can lower. Okay. And so once that research gets out there and people start laughing at cardiologists when they recommend Crestor or Lipitor, they're like, dude, I'll just eat 12 Oreo cookies a day. Why would I want to take a pharmaceutical for that? The LDL's dead. Nobody's going to be talking about that anymore. In just a few more months, no doctor, the only doctor who's going to be the doctor who's not on social media and doesn't keep up with his or her reading. That's the only people that are going to be trying to scare you with LDL cholesterol. It's going to be just a dead model. And so now they're like, okay, I guess they tried for a minute to talk about TMAO. Remember that? You don't hear much about TMAO anymore because it was shot in the head by multiple just egregious, foolish things that would elevate TMAO. But now their sexy darlings are ApoB and LP(a). That's the ones they want to talk about currently. But there's some research in the pipeline, Cynthia, and when it comes out is going to make them look just as foolish as trying to talk to somebody about their total cholesterol. It's like, what are you talking about, dude? And so I'm not a big fan of those. I used to really love the NMR lipoprofile with all the particle sizes and numbers. The more I look at that, it's like, why even check that? Why do I care? Because I know that if my patient adopts and sticks to a proper human diet, all those numbers are going to go where they need to go anyway. Right? I think all of that, trying to talk about these little particles and these little markers, is still it's the dying gasp of the germ model of disease when it comes to trying to treat a chronic metabolic disease with the germ theory model. It just doesn't work. It's never going to work. All it's going to do is make the big pharmaceutical houses billions of dollars. It's going to make you as a doctor, basically, you're going to be castrated as a doctor. You're not going to have any meaningful effect on your patients. But now you'll have a good effect on the pharmaceutical houses' bottom line. They'll probably even bring you some free lunch, maybe even take you to a steak dinner, right? But you're not going to have any meaningful benefit, any meaningful impact. You're basically impotent as a healthcare provider if you continue down this road of the germ model when it comes to chronic health. That it's a dying model. It is literally, the end is in sight, but you can't see it if you're not looking, because all you see is the advertisements on CNN or Fox News that are all big pharma ads. Or if you get on social media, you see all of these influencers who are getting checks from the Coca-Cola and Pepsi, either directly or indirectly, or getting a check from some other corporation who doesn't give a damn about your health. They just want to make money. So I think that we're very near a tipping point when it comes to chronic medical conditions and metabolic disease. I think we're very near a tipping point where the average person is going to be like, that's all a load of bunk. I'm not doing that. I'm going to focus on the food I eat and the junk I avoid. And I'm going to focus on living a proper human lifestyle. And I think that is going to lead directly to the bankruptcy of billion-dollar corporations. And it's not that I'm against the corporations. It's that I'm for the health of my individual patients and for all of the other patients out there on social media who happen to listen to me. I'm for their best health. That's what I'm here for. I'm not here to make $1 million. I'm here to save 1 million lives, to save 1 million legs from getting amputated, 1 million eyes from not going blind, 1 million kidneys from not having to be on dialysis, 1 million granddaughters and grandsons not having to go visit their grandparent in the nursing home. because it's not fun to go visit your relatives at a nursing home. Nobody wants to do that. So you're literally tearing apart a family because of the improper nutrition advice that grandma or grandpa got. I mean, how unethical, how immoral is that? I don't know. It feels very immoral to me, but yet a lot of influencers are taking a check to promote a lifestyle and a diet that's going to lead directly to that. And so I have great hope that as more and more people wake up and then they start to impact their friends and family and say, hey, you need to listen to this this podcast. Cynthia Thurlow, you need to watch this YouTube video by Dr. Berry. You need to buy this book by Professor Ben Bikman. The more that word of mouth spreads, I think it's a matter of time. I think the dominoes are beginning to fall, and I think eventually there are going to be large corporations that are sued out of existence, that are probably litigated out of existence, and perhaps even criminally prosecuted out of existence because of the dastardly behavior over the last few decades. And I'm happy to see that because ultimately I'm here to help people have a healthy life and live a healthy life and eat a healthy diet. That's what gets me up every morning.
Well, I'm so very grateful for the work that you do and the empowering message that you share with your community and obviously with my community. I know that you recently co-authored another book. I have your first book, Lies My Doctor Told Me, which is one I recommend frequently. Let my listeners know about the new book. Obviously, I think it's conditioned for individuals that are north of 50. So you and I are in that demographic, but let us know what's in there.
I actually have two new books. One is called Kicking Ass After 50. And I wrote this with my good friend, Zane Griggs, who lives in Nashville. He's been a fitness instructor for decades. He's 52 or 53 now. He looks amazing. He would put any 35-year-old to shame. I'm also in fairly good condition. I don't go to the gym, but I do work on the farm. And so we decided to write this book, and it is written towards men, but every principle in it applies directly to women who are either over 50, or if you're in your 40s and you can hear 50 coming and you don't want it to be what you've seen your mom and dad's 50s to look like, it doesn't have to look that way. Regardless of where you're starting from right now, you can be that 50-year-old that everybody's envious of. Okay. You can be that 50-year-old that the grandkids they beg to come to your house because they know you're going to be in the backyard kicking the soccer ball with them, or you're going to be doing that craft with them because you feel good and you're healthy and you're still physically active and you still got plenty of muscle mass and your bones are very strong. You might even be in the backyard climbing a tree with them because you're not worried about osteoporosis, even though you're 55 or 60 or older. I've got one guy in our private group. He made a shirt that says "Kicking Ass After 70." To echo the book, right? He's like, I'm over 70 and my grandkids, they literally want to come live with me because we're outside doing stuff. I'm not in the recliner. I'm not on the sofa. I'm up, I'm active, I'm happy, I'm engaged. That's how, so, people used to realize that our elderly were the repository of wisdom and knowledge. But now we're like, oh, they're old and washed up, put them in the nursing home. And that's not, so if you hear 50 coming or you're over 50, that's what young people think about you. There's only one way to prove them wrong, and that's to read this book and start living this life and prove them wrong. And then I know you and I were talking about all these labs earlier. If anybody wants to know more about labs, I got this little book called Common Sense Labs that I wrote with my good friend Kim Howerton. Kim was misdiagnosed. She had hypothyroidism. Took 12 doctors 20 years to diagnose her. She was given every pharmaceutical in the book. She had hypothyroidism, and they just missed it over and over and over again. So she was motivated. I was motivated as a doctor to say, hey, check a damn fasting insulin, right? So we basically put all those labs in this book that tells you not only what labs you need, also why you need them. So when your doctor says, well, I wouldn't even know what to do with the results, there's a paragraph that literally tells your doctor, this is what you do with the results. This is why you should order that. Or if your doctor says, well, your insurance ain't going to pay for that, we got the ICD-10 codes in here that'll get it paid for. if you can't afford to go to ownyourlabs.com and get them yourself. So Common Sense Labs, I'll send you a link to that. It's on Amazon. There's also an Audible version of Kicking Ass After 50 that's got a bunch of bonus content. Basically, in between the chapters, Zane and I shoot the shit talking about this particular topic or another and how people have gotten it so wrong for so long. And so there's an Audible and a paperback on Amazon of Kicking Ass After 50. There's a paperback of Common Sense Labs. I think it would be difficult to do an Audible of a lab book. So there probably is not going to be an Audible of that.
Oh, I love all the contributions. And to tell you, we could have easily made this a 3-hour podcast because I
Yes.
had so much prep, so many questions. I'll have to have you back for a fourth time to talk. You know, people wanted to know about women and the things in the, you know, the things that are happening in our bodies between perimenopause and menopause and insulin sensitivity and how
Yeah.
things start to shift with these hormonal fluctuations. Please let my listeners know how to connect with you, how to connect to your amazing YouTube channel, which is prolific. And you have an amazing community there. Obviously, we'll put links to your books as well.
So I've got this little YouTube channel
It's not little.
that I try to give good nutrition and good medical advice on. If I'm feeling particularly snarky, you'll find me on Twitter. If I'm feeling loving and helpful, you'll find me on Instagram or Facebook. And then we have a private community now with thousands of people because there's a lot of stuff I can't talk about on YouTube or I'll get a strike, right? And so inside of our private community, we answer all questions. Some questions on YouTube, I'm like, we can't really talk about that here, but we can talk about that in the private group. And some people just need a tribe of people around them with a common goal. That's what our community is. And so literally it's $5 a month to get in the door. That's how much it costs, if anybody's wondering. So yeah, again, I'm not trying to make $1 million here. I'm trying to save 1 million people, but I do got to pay the bill. So $5 a month. You can, I guess, shoot me if that seems offensive, but we try to keep it as affordable as possible. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm working on about 3 other books right now that are in the works that'll be out sometime within the next 3 months to 13 years. I don't know. Blame it on my ADHD. But I'm always trying to help people improve their health. Simple steps. Eliminate this, add this. And it almost always does not include a prescription medication. And it almost always does not include an expensive supplement. You don't need any of that crap to start to improve your health today, right now. As soon as you click the end button on this interview, you can start improving your health, or you can start helping somebody you love.
Well, and I think we really have to talk about the fact that a lot of these processed food companies are essentially drug dealers. You know, they are facilitating manufacturing and marketing products to vulnerable populations and, you know, to all westernized countries. And I just think, you know, for me, it was really enlightening very recently to wear a continuous glucose monitor. And for anyone who is listening, yes, metabolically healthy people, really beneficial. And I'll tell you why in a second. I have been largely, I would say, very protein focused. I've done very well with higher protein, moderate fats, carb cycling. That has worked for me. No grains, no gluten, and no dairy for a long time. And that has worked well for me. And I kept trying to figure out, I was like, you know, I'm another year older and maybe I need to tweak things, because I've come to find out that what may work for you for 6 to 12 months may not continue working for you. And what I found out from wearing continuous glucose monitors, first and foremost, with very few variances, my blood sugar is very well controlled, which is a good thing. However, certain foods that seem very benign, because I do carb cycle. And so I was trying different types of carbohydrates. You know, my functional medicine doc said, why don't you try a little bit of grains? Why don't you try a little bit of this? Fine. Plantains, a plantain cooked in coconut oil and sea salt, or 2 tablespoons of rice, or, you know, some squash. I mean, spiked my blood sugars. I mean, it was like 150. I mean, I had no numbers like that. And so I think it can be very valuable, even if you just use a glucometer, to monitor your blood sugar, to see your N of 1. So your one individual's response to specific macronutrients. And for me, I do well. Again, I still do well with protein and fats. I actually upped my fat intake because I started to find the one thing that kept my blood sugar really stable with a little, insulin secretion was more fats, little less protein, and very little carbs. And so too much to what we were talking about, really determining what works for your body, but also being open-minded to the fact that you may need to change things up. What works for you, what worked for me almost 2 years ago after coming out of the hospital was full carnivore. That wouldn't work for me right now.
Yep. I understand. And I think everyone should tweak their diet and play with their diet and experiment like you're doing. I think you're setting an excellent example. And I completely agree with you that CGMs or continuous glucose monitors are such a powerful tool. And even for people without diabetes, even for people without pre-diabetes. And I've actually saw some kickback on Twitter that it's insensitive. If you don't have diabetes, you shouldn't have a CGM. That's just elitist and you're entitled. And this is vital. Everyone's health is important. And I think for each individual person, your personal mental and physical health is the most important thing in your life. Because if you're not healthy, you can't really take care of your loved ones and your family. You can't take care of your business if you're not healthy. And it is routine for people, even without diabetes, even without pre-diabetes, when they wear a CGM, they invariably report back, my A1C is 5.3. I'm fine. But when I ate that rice, or when I ate that corn, or when I ate that bread or that pasta, my blood sugar went up to 160 or 180. And this is in people who are not diabetic or not even pre-diabetic. Anytime you eat a food that spikes your blood sugar above 140, especially if you're not a diabetic, that is a huge red flag that what you've essentially done is you've eaten so many carbohydrates in that meal, whatever was in it, that and the human pancreas is a very powerful organ, very intelligent organ. It's just amazing what the human pancreas can do. But you actually overate the ability of your pancreas to control your blood sugar. That is a huge red flag that you ate too many carbohydrates in that meal. And you should not do that, because every time your blood sugar spikes over 140, whether you're a diabetic, pre-diabetic, or not, you're doing permanent microscopic damage to every tiny artery in your body. The arteries in your eyes, in your brain, in your heart, in your reproductive organs, in your kidneys. You're damaging those tiny arteries and arterioles. Some of that damage is permanent. And indeed, we start to see kidney failure in people who are just pre-diabetic. They're not even diabetic yet, but they're starting to have signs of permanent kidney damage. And that's because of all those meals that spike their blood sugar over 140. And so I think the CGM is vital. Every diabetic in the world should have access to a continuous glucose monitor. Anybody diagnosed with prediabetes or even hyperglycemia needs a continuous glucose monitor so that they can use it to tease out which foods spike me over 140. I need to avoid those foods. They are not healthy for me. And if ultimately wearing that CGM and making a list of foods, if that causes you to exclude an entire food group, as they say, then that's not you irrationally excluding an entire food group because you have an eating disorder. That is direct feedback from your pancreas saying, hey, honey, every time you eat the bread and the pasta and the cakes and the pies and cookies, you're doing damage to your body. That's probably bad. You probably shouldn't do that. And so if the CGM uncovers the fact that you should avoid an entire food group, which is bread and grains, then you should do that. You should listen to your pancreas, because the human pancreas has been doing this job for a long damn time, right? And if it cannot accommodate your blood sugar when you've eaten those things, that is clear, black and white physiological evidence that you should not eat them.
I think that's important for people to understand. So those that are still metabolically flexible, like my fasting insulin was last 2.1 and my fasting blood sugars are always in the high 70s, low 80s. I'm a healthy weight. I exercise, I sleep well. And I still was stunned. I mean, I literally probably had half a cup of plantains and I probably had 3 tablespoons of rice, but I thought rice has definitely been one of those things I haven't done well with. But so important that you find out for yourself. And if you can't afford a CGM and or your family provider is not willing to write a script, a lot of these companies will let you have one for 2 weeks for free. And then you can decide for yourself what you want to invest in. I myself continued my subscription with my CGM because I wanted to do more experimentation, because now I feel like I'm onto something. I'm like, okay, I may actually have to go lower carb than I have been for a period of time. And that's not a bad thing. And it may be that I cycle my carbs and I go in and out of ketosis. But for anyone who's listening, who's curious about that, I think that's a really very helpful, beneficial way. If you're looking for weight loss, resistance strategies, that would definitely be a top one. What are your thoughts on things like berberine and chromium GTF and some of these supplements that I see, especially on berberine, great data, in terms of comparing that to glucophage or metformin, but are you using this with your patients?
Yeah, I think that berberine, chromium, all these things help, right? But the question we're faced with is, am I trying to take berberine and chromium and cinnamon and curcumin? Am I trying to take those so that I can eat an inappropriate diet? Right? And that's a valid question, because I think what we're uncovering with the CGMs and with the C-peptides and with the fasting insulins, we're uncovering the fact that there is a spectrum of food that is the proper human diet. And it is a low carbohydrate diet. For some of us, like your teenage boys, it may be under 100 total grams of carbs a day, and they do just fine. As you get older, or if you're on the other end of that bell curve and you're very insulin resistant, like I am, then it's an even lower carbohydrate diet. But that, I think the evidence is becoming quite clear that low carb, whether you're talking about low carb paleo, just low carb, keto, ketovore, carnivore, those are all on a proper human diet spectrum. And my definition of a proper human diet is a diet that gives you all of the amino acids and fatty acids and vitamins and minerals that your body needs, and is low carb enough so that you don't spike your blood sugar, so that you don't have an elevated C-peptide, and so that you don't have an elevated fasting insulin. In that spectrum is a proper human diet for you. Some of us, like your teenage boys, can get away with more carbohydrates. Some of us, like me, I'm 52 now, I have to be as low carb as I can get to keep my weight where I want it, to keep my waistline where I want it, to keep my mental and physical clarity and strength where I want it, and to keep my metabolic physiological markers like A1C, C-peptide, and fasting insulin, and my CGM readings. If I want to keep all those things at optimal levels, I have to be almost zero carb. And I don't think everybody needs to be that, but I think everybody needs to know where they currently fall on the proper human diet spectrum, because no human on the planet is it healthy for you to eat a bowl of Special K with skim milk and drink a glass of orange juice and have 2 pieces of whole wheat toast.
Like dessert.
That is not the proper human diet. That will invariably spike your insulin, your blood sugar, your levels of inflammation. It will store fat inside your abdomen, in your liver, and even in your pancreas. That is not part of the proper human diet. Is it fine to have it as an occasional treat on your birthday and anniversary and Christmas? Sure. Just like it's okay to have a couple of mixed drinks on your birthday and Christmas and anniversary. But that it does not mean, since you had 2 drinks over your birthday and you didn't die, that doesn't mean, okay, I'll just have 2 drinks every day. That would be dumb. And it's dumb to eat these foods, these highly ultra processed frankenfoods, fake foods that the big corporations try to sell us because they make 1,000% markup profit on them. That is not part of a proper human diet, and they always ultimately lead to chronic disease, suffering, inflammation, and ultimately an early death.
You know, it's interesting. I started watching a series that I've watched before. I trained in Baltimore, and so I have an affinity for Baltimore. And the series is called The Wire. I've watched
Yeah.
it more than once. Usually every couple of years, I get kind of reminiscent, think back to my Baltimore days. And one of the things that it really impressed upon me as I'm watching the series is, the disparities that we have in terms of people that live in the inner city who don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And it may be that their corner grocery store is all they have. And so, for anyone that's listening, that is in a position where they just don't have as much access to fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that, what would your suggestions be for them? And it really is in a means to saying, like, good, better, best. That's always kind of my mentality. Like, if you're out to dinner, let's think pre-COVID, we're out to dinner and you can go anywhere you want and you're traveling, and maybe you splurge on something, but trying to find the best option that's available for you at that time. So for people that are at more have less flexibility, aren't able, don't own a car, can't just go to a farmer's market, they just don't have as much access to healthier choices. How do you help people kind of navigate those circumstances?
Well, I can tell you what I would do if I were stuck in the inner city, which I was before. I trained for 7 years in Memphis, and I lived downtown Memphis in the dorms and then in an apartment. And it's true, it's kind of a food desert now. It's changed some now, but back then you had to drive 20, 25, 30 minutes to get to a grocery of any size, of any meaning, right? But there was a convenience store on every corner. And so if I were stuck in that situation, I would live on meat. I would live on hot dogs. I would live on bologna. I would live on potted meat, Spam. That's what I would live on, because that would be the only way. Beef jerky. That's the only way I could live on a proper human diet that kept me as healthy as possible without becoming metabolically sicker, right? And so that's what I would do if I were stuck in that. I would just live on the cheap meat, and hopefully I could get some ground beef somewhere or some minced beef, and I would live on that. And that's what I would do until I could do better, because it's very inexpensive to do that. It costs the same. You can buy, a can of Spam or a big family size bag of Doritos. They're about the same price. And so I would live on Spam and hot dogs and bologna until I could do better.
I think that's really helpful because one of the things I learned, I had Rob Wolf on a few months ago, and his podcast episode just dropped. And, he just wrote the amazing book, Sacred Cow. And one of the things that he and I were kind of chuckling about was that, the analysis of grass fed beef versus feedlot beef, there was not a ton of difference beyond the omega-3, omega-6 balance.
That's
And
right.
so for anyone who's listening, who's saying, oh, there's no way. No, really, you could get ground meat in like a corner grocery store that may not be grass fed, that is going to be superior than, eating that bag of Doritos and the can of Coke and whatever, Frosted Flakes or whatever garbage looks more tantalizing, but you're going to get more value out of the animal protein than you are out of a lot of these highly processed foods. Now, I'm curious, what your position is when people are looking to kind of change their lifestyle, lose weight. What's your position on sleep and stress? Because I find that these are two areas where a lot of people don't put a lot of emphasis, but yet they're so critically important.
Yeah, they are very important. But I think, and so, but here's the problem: if you talk about that kind of stuff too much, do I think that getting adequate sleep is more important than eating a proper human diet? No. Do I think exercising is more important than eating a proper human diet? No. Do I think that, having sex and other good, natural, normal physiological things are better than eating a proper human diet? No. Have human beings been under some kind of stress our entire existence on this planet? Yes. Is meditating and taking hot and cold showers, is that more important than eating a proper human diet? No. Do they matter? Yes. But I think that you're getting off, because I love to focus people on the 80%.
Mhm.
Where are you going to get 80% of your benefit from? And that is your diet. It ain't exercise. It ain't sleep. It ain't, taking hot and cold shower. None of that stuff is in the 80%. Those are 10% factors at best, but in many cases, they're 1 or 2% factors. Does that make sense? Because if you talk too much about sleep, then all of a sudden we've got this huge industry springing up with all these sleep supplements, right? And people think, well, sleep is important. I heard Cynthia say that. So I'm going to buy this, all these sleep supplements so I can sleep better. And they ignore their diet. And so you're over here piddling around with the 1 and 2% improvements you can get with good sleep, which is absolutely real. And you're ignoring the 80% improvement you can get from eating a proper human diet. I think sleep's very important. I've got YouTube videos about it. I think stress control is very important. I've got YouTube videos about it. All that stuff is important, but never, ever take your eye off what's going to give you 80% of your metabolic benefit. And that is eating a proper human diet spectrum.
Well, metabolic health is actually, we're noticing drastic improvements in a certain subset of the population, but the vast majority of the general population, their metabolic health continues to deteriorate, which is very sad, but also very true. And the Lancet article is, I think, absolutely accurate. Now, there's so many presumptions that the Lancet authors made, so many foundational understandings, paradigms of theirs that go into the writing of this article. And I think it'd be very helpful for people to break those down. But yes, if you have either uncontrolled diabetes, and this goes for type 1, type 2, LADA, MODY, any form of diabetes, if you follow the standard, if you follow no advice, you're probably going to hasten your death even more than 3.5 years for each decade you have it. But if you follow the standard advice, the state-of-the-art advice, the scientific consensus advice, then yeah, you're probably going to be knocking 3.5 years off your life for every decade that you follow the American Diabetes Association recommendations. I think that's probably true, if not worse. And there are more and more people are waking up every day that are like, yeah, I don't want to, knock 10 years off my life because I had type 2 diabetes for 30 years. I'd like those 10 years of life, please. I'd like to tack those on at the end. And there is a way to do that, but it's not by following the ADA recommendations.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that the more I understand about a lot of these organizations, they're not designed with metabolic health in mind. It's designed to kind of potentiate this focus on pharmaceuticals, very little on lifestyle medicine. And you and I both know that lifestyle really is that first crucial piece to lasting metabolic health. And what's interesting is the ADA had a statement published in its economic costs of diabetes care in 2022, the economic burden of diabetes. When I read this, I just about fell out of my chair. The total estimated cost is $412 billion with a B dollars, including over $300 billion in direct medical costs and over $100 billion in indirect costs attributable to diabetes. That's staggering.
Yeah. And another thing that I think, and that's a very apt figure. We need to talk about that. We need to have a public discussion about the cost of diabetes in the United States, but also another cost that people forget is the environmental impact of that. A lot of my plant-based friends and vegan friends love to talk about, the carbon footprint of raising beef or raising animals, but they don't really want to talk about the carbon footprint of the healthcare industry. And when you're mismanaging millions and millions of diabetics, they're going to need lots of healthcare. They're going to need lots of pharmaceuticals that are made in factories, which have a very large carbon footprint. They're going to need lots of inpatient hospital care, which is going to have a huge carbon footprint. And so not only just the economic cost, the drain on our economic system, but the greenhouse, the gas effect, the carbon footprint effect, all the waste that's generated by this healthcare and by the pharmaceutical industry. I think that's also a conversation that needs to be had publicly.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. And I was having a conversation with my husband, who's an engineer. He's not a healthcare provider. And I was giving him a medication that was being given subcutaneously, and he was watching all the Tinker Toys. You know, you have to take off. There's a package for the needle. There's a package for the syringe. There's these alcohol wipes. And he looked at me and he said, "This is for one injection on one person." And I said, "Imagine the magnification of most individuals if they're getting insulin, and there are a lot of type 1s obviously, but also type 2s that are taking insulin, just the net impact day after day of injections, swabs, pharmaceutical agents. You know, 1 in 4 healthcare dollars in the US is going towards diabetes care, 61% of which is directly attributable to diabetes. So it really becomes this large net impact that I think a lot of people may not even be aware of. And certainly you mentioned the environmental impact. And I think most individuals, unless they're working in healthcare, they have absolutely no idea where do all these plastics go, all these health hazard bags, you know, these health hazard containers. I recall that I have a child with EpiPens, and he didn't need his EpiPens and they expired, and I couldn't get rid of them. I tried to take him to the pharmacy. I tried to take him to the pediatrician's office. No one wants to take him. I said, "What am I supposed to do? Throw him in the garbage?" They were like, "Yeah, just throw him in the garbage." I was like, and this is going to go in landfill and just sit there till, you know, who knows when.
Yeah, the amount of disposable plastic used in the healthcare industry is gigantic. A lot of people think that we really did a big thing by banning plastic straws. And what you don't understand is that average size hospital, just one day of existence of the average size hospital, the majority of the clinical procedures, which would become literally would be obviated if you reversed 90% of the cases of type 2 diabetes. You would say you would protect the oceans, you would protect the environment from so many tons of plastic that it would make banning plastic straws a kind of a laughing frivolity. It's just foolishness to think you've really done something when at one day of a large hospital, their plastic waste is crazy. So how many tons a year of plastic are generated by the healthcare industry? Most of it unnecessary, most of it made necessary only because of the bad nutrition advice and bad advice coming from organizations like the American Heart Association and the American Diabetes Association.
That's interesting. Many years ago, there was a postdoc at the hospital system that I worked at, and he was Australian, and he was an MD, PhD, really bright guy. And this is in the early 2000s. And he said, "Cynthia, I don't know what it is about you Americans." And he's like, and I say this in the most loving way possible, because I think you all are great, but why do you wait so long to intervene on diabetes? This is 20 years ago. He was saying this. And now,
Yep.
you know, those words really ring true to me, that we wait until people get diabetes. So what do you think are some of the biggest impediments to getting earlier diagnoses? Do you think it's the kind of traditional allopathic model where you have to hit a certain metric in order to be said, okay, you've transitioned from insulin resistance to diabetes, now let's get aggressive? Because we know that most diabetics are undiagnosed for 5 to 10 years before they actually fully present with full-blown diabetes.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back even further than that. I think when the germ theory of disease became very popular a long time ago, we're talking many decades ago, and it kind of overwhelmed the terrain model of disease. And the terrain model of disease, as presented by its creator, was full of holes. It's full of inconsistencies and errors. And I'm not in any way advocating that we go back to the terrain model exclusively. But what we have to have is a hybrid model. When it comes to infectious disease caused by bacteria and fungus and most viruses, I think absolutely we should use the germ model of disease. But the problem is that mainstream medicine many decades ago decided, perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously, to apply the germ theory model to all of medicine. And that's what we're seeing. And so if you have something like type 2 diabetes, then you need a specific drug for that, or you need a specific infusion or a specific injection or a specific medical procedure for that. You have this problem, therefore, here's this product that's going to the average person would think, oh, it's going to reverse it or cure it. No. It's just going to manage and maintain it, because the germ theory says that type 2 diabetes is a chronic progressive disease. And so it's very hard for doctors who have practiced under that paradigm their entire career. It's very hard for them to go, wait a minute, maybe type 2 diabetes is just a chronic carbohydrate toxicity or a chronic carbohydrate overdose syndrome. Maybe if we stopped poisoning the human body with too many highly processed carbohydrates, maybe we should look at type 2 diabetes as a poisoning event. And so when you adopt that paradigm, what's the paradigm? If someone's has been poisoned, well, you want to stop the offending poison. That's the number one treatment. And then two, you want to do something, if you need to, acutely, to cancel the ongoing poisoning happening in the body, right? And so it's so hard for mainstream doctors and dietitians to understand, look, you're following a model that never leads to remission. It never leads to reversing the type 2 diabetes. It by definition, it does not lead to that. Many of the FDA approved medications for type 2 diabetes, they got their FDA approval by being slightly better than placebo. Right? So literally, if the medicine lowered someone's hemoglobin A1C by 0.2% or 0.3%, boom, there's your FDA approval. And they don't have to prove that they're better than any other drugs on the market. They just have to prove that they're just a little bit better than placebo and not acutely dangerous. That is the bar that they have to cross to get FDA approval. And so it's very hard for doctors to understand this. And when it comes to type 2 diabetes in particular, you're right. You can actually check certain labs on a patient and you can predict type 2 diabetes 10 years before they develop it. But in mainstream modern medicine, the average doctor acts like, oh, nope, you don't have type 2 diabetes, so nothing we need to do about this. Even though their A1C is now 5.8, 5.9, it's like, it's pre-diabetes, cut back on the candy and soft drinks, and I will check it again in a year. And then almost no mainstream doctor checks the fasting insulin level. And that's the key. If we could just get every doctor to start checking fasting insulin levels on any human, not just adults, but also children, if they have even one risk factor for type 2 diabetes, if they would just start checking a fasting insulin, that's your time machine. You literally can look into the future and go, oh, you're headed straight towards type 2 diabetes. We have to make some changes now to the terrain, not only to your body, but your diets, because that's part of the terrain, right? And so I was just watching a discussion between a very popular plant-based cardiologist and another guy, and the guy was saying, do you check, he's like, no, there's only 15% of adults who have type 2 diabetes and maybe 30% who have insulin resistance. And the doc was on my side was going, what? Have you checked fasting insulins? No, we don't typically check that. And so this is a very intelligent cardiologist who's very concerned and is trying hard to do a good job, but is literally putting on self-blinders. Every day he hangs that stethoscope around his shoulders, and he cannot see what's right in front of his face is that over 80% of adults in the United States have at least one marker of metabolic disease. And if you add a fasting insulin to that, I would guess it goes up to 95%. And that's in adults. Now let's talk about children, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds. If you check the fasting insulin on every one of those children that has at least one risk factor for developing type 2 diabetes, you would catch it years before they even started doing any damage. But the average doctor's blind to that. And I wanted so bad to jump into the scene of that interview and say, I would challenge you for the next month, doctor, and I won't name any doctors because I'm not trying to call people out. For the next month, will you check a fasting insulin on every one of your patients? And the cost of a fasting insulin now is $10, $15, $20, depending. And just that challenge alone, it would become impossible for that doctor to ignore the metabolic disease that's right under his nose each and every day that he is currently blind to. And I think that as your message gets out there and my message and others in this space, just that one key change to medical practice, because it's very hard to recommend a plant-based diet to people if when you check their fasting insulin is 25 or 30 or 35 or 40 or even higher. You're going to go, gosh, this doesn't make any sense. I thought a plant-based diet was the healthiest choice, but these people are all hyperinsulinemic when they're following my plant-based diet. And that can't be good. And then they're going to go to pubmed.gov and they're going to type in hyperinsulinemia. And they're going to realize that hundreds of chronic medical diseases are closely associated with a patient's level of insulin in their blood. And that's it. They're at that moment, they either have to wake up or they have to consciously bury their head in the sand. And almost no doctor is going to make the conscious decision to say, I'm not going to check any more fasting insulins because I don't like the results. Any good doctor is going to say, I've got to learn more about this. I was not aware that fasting insulin was this powerful of a marker, of a proxy marker. And now that I know that, I need to adjust my practice accordingly. I need to adjust the nutrition advice I'm giving accordingly. And then that's it. And so I think the degree to which we get mainstream medical practitioners, both doctors and dietitians, to start looking at the fasting insulin, that's when all the foolishness stops, because it can take 5 or 10 years for someone's hemoglobin A1C to get up to 6.5, right? A lot of doctors don't take prediabetes seriously. I consider it to be early type 2 diabetes. It's not pre anything, because studies at the University of Tennessee in Memphis and many other places have shown definitively that damage is being done to the kidneys, to the heart, to the brain, to the retina during prediabetes. You don't have to wait until that A1C gets up to 6.5. Damage is already being done. And so if damage is being done, then that by definition is a disease. And so you have to give dietary advice that's going to get not only the hemoglobin A1C back down to normal, but also that gets the fasting insulin back down to normal as well. And once you start giving that kind of nutrition advice, guess what, Cynthia? You're telling people to eat a proper human diet, because if you're eating too many carbohydrates, too many highly processed carbohydrates, you're going to have hyperinsulinemia. And at some point, you're going to develop prediabetes, which is eventually going to turn into type 2 diabetes. And then all the disastrous complications, not only for that individual patient, but also for their family members who love them, and also for the healthcare industry who has then to treat those patients, and then for the country, the nation as a whole, who has to pay for that treatment if people can't afford their own treatment, and then has to deal with all the plastic waste, all the carbon footprint that comes out of that. All of that stuff literally could be solved overnight if we said, hey, you got to check a fasting insulin if somebody has at least one risk factor for type 2 diabetes. That would, within months, that would tear down the entire problem that you and I are right now talking about.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point that a fasting insulin is very inexpensive. If your healthcare practitioner is uncomfortable ordering it, you can go to companies like Own Your Labs. I have no affiliation with this company, but they beat LabCorp and Quest costs. It's a
I think ownyourlabs.com. Also, I'm not affiliated with them. I think their price now for a fasting insulin is $9 or $10.
Skip your fancy coffee drink and go get your fasting insulin checked. And I think that it really begs to have the discussion about what are the labs that you feel, you've mentioned a few, you've mentioned the fasting insulin, the A1C. What other labs do you think are really indicative / helpful when you're trying to differentiate who's at greatest risk for going on to develop type 2 diabetes versus people that have a little bit of time to make some targeted changes immediately that can course correct?
Yeah, so the hemoglobin A1C is the preeminent test. Now, there are multiple medical conditions, multiple medications, and also personal habits that can affect your hemoglobin A1C. I've got YouTube videos about that. I'm coming to like a glycated albumin much better because there are multiple things that can make a red blood cell live a longer life or live a shorter life. We're seeing in the carnivore community, many people's red blood cells are living longer. And so they're getting this falsely elevated hemoglobin A1C of 5.7, 5.8, even 5.9 sometimes. And they're like, wait a minute, I used to have type 2 diabetes. I don't like where this is going. But if you check a glycated albumin on these people, it's stone cold normal because their nutrient dense carnivore diet is giving the red blood cells all they need to live for 120, 130, maybe even 140 days. That gives it more time to glycate, and they're getting a falsely elevated A1C. We also know that chronic overconsumption of alcohol can give you a falsely low A1C, but it doesn't affect the glycated albumin level. And so I like the A1C for the average person, but there are some people that you need to check a glycated albumin instead, because whether you're eating the worst diet or the best diet, regardless of what medical condition you have, almost without exception, if you're an alcoholic, if you're smoking meth, it doesn't matter. Your glycated albumin is going to tell the truth. The next test, which you can tell I'm in love with, is a fasting insulin, because it removes so much bullshit. Not only does it make it immediately obvious that the American Diabetes Association's recommendations, the recipes that they recommend on their website, is complete and utter bunk. It makes that immediately apparent, right? It makes all the recipes that DaVita recommends for people with chronic kidney disease. It makes that not only look like bunk, but it almost like makes it look criminal. Like, why would you be recommending a recipe to someone with chronic kidney disease when the recipe itself is going to make their condition worse? I don't know. That sounds unethical, if not illegal to me. It makes also so much advice that are given by influencers on the internet, on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. It makes their advice foolish on its face. When you check a fasting insulin, you realize that fruit smoothie or that yogurt bowl or that whatever beautiful thing that they're saying you should drink or eat every day, that's gonna raise your fasting insulin. And that's very, very unhealthy. And so with that $10 test, the fasting insulin, not only do you shut up all of the mainstream health and nutrition advice, but also all of the alternate advice that many people who their eyes are open now. They're like, the American Diabetes Association, their recommendations are foolish. They're dangerous, actually. And so then everybody starts looking for an alternative, right? That's human nature. It's like, well, that's obviously not the solution. Where's the solution? And millions upon millions of people find this pretty influencer on Instagram, and they're like, oh, okay, I'll do that. And so I'm going to buy all of their supplements, and I'm going to start drinking this fruit juice smoothie, and I'm going to start making these beautiful yogurt bowls. Well, a fasting insulin for $10, you realize that's not the answer either. And you don't need all those supplements, because none of those supplements are going to help your fasting insulin level. They might lower your blood sugar a little bit, but they're not going to affect the A1C or the glycated albumin much. And they're not going to affect the fasting insulin level at all. And so really with those two tests, you can ferret out and ignore 95% of the bullshit coming at you from all directions, both mainstream medicine and alternative medicine, naturopathic medicine, holistic medicine, all that. Those two tests just eliminate the bullshit. I'm going to start calling them bullshit eliminators. Because if you check an A1C and a fasting insulin and they're not both normal, you're doing something wrong. Whose advice are you following? And I don't care how many thousands of dollars you spend on supplements or infusions. If those two numbers are not normal, you're not metabolically healthy. Another great marker is triglycerides, right? And so if you're following a diet and it's making your triglycerides higher than 150, that's bad advice. You need to reassess that nutrition advice. Another is the HDL cholesterol level. If you're following advice and your HDL is very low, if you're following a lifestyle that causes your HDL cholesterol to be very low, that's bad. You should stop that. And so really there's 5 tests. Of course, you want your fasting glucose, but that can be misleading in many, many, many ways, right? You want a hemoglobin A1C, which can be misleading for a few people. If you're one of those people, and most people, if they've researched their own medical conditions and the medication they're taking, they know if they have something that affects their A1C level, then you're going to check a glycated albumin. And then people who really are invested in their health are going to check a fasting insulin. And then most doctors are going to check a lipid panel, but they're only going to focus on the total cholesterol and the LDL cholesterol, very often completely ignoring the triglycerides, which are absolutely a proven marker of metabolic health, and the HDL cholesterol, which is also very strongly associated with being metabolically healthy if it's normal. With those tests, you can bypass so much in the way of personal suffering from chronic diseases yourself. Then you can obviate all the suffering your family's going to do, that as you chronically suffer from type 2 diabetes or another metabolic condition. They're going to have to come visit you after you've had that amputation. They're going to have to take care of you when you get home with that amputation. You're blind now. They're going to have to take care of you, or they're going to have to pay somebody else to take care of you. You've had that heart attack or a stroke, have severe kidney failure, or you have the post-stroke sequela. Now you're in a nursing home or assisted living. Who's going to pay for that? It's either going to be your family or it's going to be your nation. Neither of which I think the average person would like to burden. Nobody wants to be a burden. But if you follow bad nutrition advice, then at some point you will become a burden to either your family or your nation. That is inevitable if you follow bad nutrition advice for too long. And nobody wants to be a burden. We want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so I think just those few tests are going to give you more information than you would get from spending thousands of dollars, reading hundreds of books, signing up for hundreds of coaching programs and this and that and the other, or donating to the American Diabetes Association every year and having a fundraiser for them and blindly following their nutrition advice.
So if you go into your 40s and you find your brain going, everything's not okay, then just pause for a moment and try not to think outside of you, because it would be very easy, especially, this is the cruelty of menopause, is